So welcome again to my behind the screen streams aimed at the theory and practice of GMing tabletop role-playing games. Again, this is primarily for a Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition campaign that I'm in the process of running. So examples are primarily going to be geared towards that system and uh, fantasy games in general, but I will try and make things as agnostic as I can. Uh, the subject, you'll be able to tell it for today, is story design, because I don't have anything I really need to prep for this session. I did all that last session and didn't get through it. Uh, so essentially, anyone who tuned in last week, uh, last session I plotted out 3 encounters to progress the side quest I was fairly confident my players were going to choose to pick up, and they did. Um, with the idea being they have to reignite some braziers to protect areas of the Shadowfell. And they picked up on that, spent half of our 2-hour session shopping, which is fine, like player driven and all that. And it's another way for them to learn about the world and engage with the NPCs in the fort. Um, Although I have noticed that when given the opportunity, players will a lot of the time pick shopping over anything else, including just time skips. So something to bear in mind for your own games. So they spent an hour or so shopping and learning more out about the fort, uh, primarily because the rogue broke his short sword, so he needed a new one. So I gave him a minor magical item and asked the player if wanted damage or utility, and um, I thought it worked out quite well because again, it's more player choice than me saying this is what you get, this is your tool. Uh, and it was just it's a non-magical short sword, but as a bonus action can douse light sources within a certain radius. Because I actually counted up what magical items they have, and they're all geared towards the kind of bigger, flashier stuff, and I wanted them to have some smaller utility items, regardless. Um, and after that, they they left the fort. They volunteered to patrol outside the fort and decided to go and reignite these braziers after the man. My brain's all over the place today. Backtracking a little bit. So the party sorcerer, who I believe I mentioned last session, discovered that the captain of the Knights Arcana here is one of the adventurers that rescued him as a child. He went back to her, they had a bit of discussion, found out where the rest of that adventuring party is. They're in Scour, they've set up their own adventuring guild. And the party warlock and rogue went with him, and the party warlock recognized one of the adventurers' names as someone he knew, he knows, who taught him about magic when he kind of first got his abilities. Uh, I think that's the main kind of character development for those of you who are interested in such things. That, as I say, they volunteered for guard duty. Burning Storm Chaser, the Tabaxi monk, was bored for a lot of it, the character, not the player, and decided to do what cats do, made their own laser pointer through control flames, a cantrip. They got their provisions, went to the armory, not realizing that this is a knight's fort, so they're probably not going to have short blades. The rogue could not use any of the weapons he was offered, and as I ended up buying a short sword with most of his starting allocation of torches, because as I said last time, light is and light sources are the primary form of currency in my version of the Shadowfell. A candle is 1 gold, a torch is 5 gold, and then smaller transactions are done primarily through supplies, food, that kind of thing. Their supplies actually were 2 torches and one of these special Hallowfire torches, which functions as a a small halo effect as per the spell in 5th edition Player's Handbook. It's just to repel lower level undead. It's modified, so it's not exactly the halo effect, but the players don't need to know that. It's probably not going to come up, and if it does, they'll learn the limitations. But they were told not to stay away from the fort, quote unquote, overnight, because the Shadowfell can change, and there's dangers that they don't know about, and that records in the fort only hint at. But they learned more about these braziers and the dead private, and decided to go and kind of reclaim the supply caches by the braziers if they could, relight the braziers, and set off. They stumbled across the first brazier by accident, breaking for lunch, leaning against a like a hillock, and they found a skeletal arm sticking up out of this hillock, and further excavation revealed it to be a cave-in had crushed a member of one of the people who'd been sent to supply the supply cache. And they started excavating, dug out the entrance to this cave, found 2 more members of the Knights Arcana, armored, dead, pretty obviously from starvation. At which point, something weird happened, and the party sorcerer went to the back of this cave, which was obviously extremely rickety and ready to fall down at any point. Noticed this 3-foot square patch of disturbed earth, and the player drew the conclusion that they tried to dig their way out. And I'm not like, players are free to draw their own conclusions. It's not, unless it's plot critical, at which point there should be other ways around it, but it's not. I don't see it as my job to correct the players when they draw conclusions that may be partially or wholly incorrect. So he left the cave and was like, there's nothing here. Moving on. And the party monk, the Tabaxi, was attending to the bodies with last rites to bury them. And then they collectively kind of realized that what they thought was a tree in front of this cave was too straight and didn't have enough branches. And on further examination, it was just a hollow. It was a pole stretching up above the tree line with holes through it, which the monk's player correctly figured out was designed as a ladder. The idea being you put like a stick through one of the holes to form a rung, and then you either leave it there and take up loads of sticks, or you just keep swapping them somehow. So they ascended this pole and found a brazier on top, and had no idea what to do with it. So they sent the rogue climbed up with the warlock on his back, and then passed the warlock up to the monk, who was still standing, holding the top of the ladder, looking out. And the warlock realized that some of the runes in this brazier were very similar to runes they found before. Before I started streaming my prep, they spent some time on a ship. They quickly figured out that it was probably a smuggling ship, due to the fact that it looked like the name, the plank of the hull that the name was painted on could be changed quite easily. And after some experimentation, despite being told not to, the party warlock realized if he essentially sacrificed one of his spell slots or a cantrip into certain areas of the ship where there were these kind of blocks of stone with runes carved into it, the ship would fly, or that stone would generate lift. And it never came up how that exactly worked, but if you want to use it as an idea, essentially it generates lift per hour of spell slot expended. Cantrips generate half an hour of lift. The warlock discovered the lift by expending a cantrip, and then the front quarter of the ship kind of floated for half an hour and then slowly lowered back to the sea. But he recognized the runes in the brazier, some of the runes in the braziers being from a block of stone like that. So he, as he, because the player couldn't make it, um, expended a spell slot and ignited the brazier, and the party immediately felt calmer and that the area was protected magically somehow. At which point the monk realised that they'd been told there were supply caches near all these braziers, and investigated the cave, and deduced that there was something buried at this 3-foot square patch of disturbed earth. Tried digging it out, failed the skill checks to do it carefully, so the place started collapsing, and then the usually fashion-conscious, cleanliness-obsessed sorcerer kind of decided that he could always get clean later, and it was all business. It was business time, and started digging. And in my game, my players have essentially extra class features. They're not tied to a class. They're all tied to a theme. Uh, the campaign itself is called Waking the Gods, and the players are quote unquote chosen of the gods. It's quote unquote because they're not the only ones, and they've only got kind of this spark, this fragment of divine power within them. Apart from the monk, who is the only chosen one as part of his storyline. And they've, due to their experiences up to this point, they've been able to tap into these fragments of power and harness them. And the sorcerers is all about, because was essentially raised, he grew up in the Shadowfell, he's sort of planar, so all his abilities tied to the planes, and his lower level ability, I believe it is that he can kind of step into the ethereal plane temporarily, so he can walk through solid objects for the space of a movement for a turn. So when he failed the skill checks as well, he managed to pick up the chest before the tunnel he was in collapsed, and then just kind of sauntered casually out. The whole party thought he was dead. They thought that the rocks had crushed him and they'd have to dig him out, but he just sauntered casually out, cape swinging, and put the chest down, and then immediately kind of magically cleaned himself in one smooth motion. But they quickly opened the chest and found some more of these stagnant, dilute, kind of expired healing potions. Have a weaker effect than ordinary ones do. Some more torches, some more of these hallow flame torches, and uh, some rotten food because of the time difference between, well, because just how long that it's been there. Oilcloth sealed can only do so much. So this took them to about lunchtime on their first day out from the fort, and after a brief discussion, they decided that they would risk an overnight, quote unquote. Obviously, there's no day and night in the Shadowfell, and make for the closest of the other braziers they'd seen. Which the monk, when he climbed to the brazier and was looking out over the canopy, estimated that it's probably half a day's travel. I'm trying to convey to my players the fluidity of travel distance in the Shadowfell, it being a morphic state, constantly changing. So that's where they're going. That one is going to be the monstrous encounter with the mold zombies, and they can kill all the zombies, or if they figure out the source of the spores, I'm going to say that if they burn the plants that emit these spores, the zombies will be at a significant or they'll be at a disadvantage for the rest of the fight, because their host isn't the right word. Their source is gone, and then after that it'll be a day to the last one, and then it'll be a day and a half back to the fort. The last one being the wildlife with the shadow blight trunks and the gloom flowers I mentioned from the various books last week. So as you can see, I don't need any NPCs because they're probably not going to meet any. The encounters are all ready. I do need to add the bookmarks to the PDFs that I use instead of lugging the paperback around with me, or the hardback around with me all the time. So that gives me some time to talk about story design and how I approach it. And that's something important to note. This whole thing, all these videos, they're about how I approach things. They're not cookie cutter approaches. Take what you want from them and then ignore the rest. And I by no means have the most experience in role-playing games. I've been playing for 8 years now, but there are people out there who have been playing for far longer. It's just stuff I've internalized and kind of cobbled together from reading advice books and articles on the internet and the rule books themselves, and following a lot of DMs on Twitter, or a lot of GMs on Twitter. They're good for advice and novel interpretations of the rules, especially when it's the creator of the rules themselves saying, I don't like this about what I created, so I do this instead. But primarily, in terms of story and writing it, there are broadly, through my understanding and how I view it, 3 different ways to approach story design. There's guided, as you can see, guided sandbox living, and guided tends to be what you get in the pre-written campaigns or adventures. These are adventures that are either intended to be one and done, or because they are published material, there's no real way for them to be open-ended. They have a definite start and a definite end, even though there are a handful of ways that the players can get there. Obviously, like examples for D&D are the starter set, or Tomb of Annihilation, or any of the other books that come out, Waterdeep, Dragon Heist. By their very nature, they can't be too open-ended because they're giving you everything that you need for a complete experience. And they're not bad by any means. Like I run the starter set for some friends, and we're going to go into Tomb of Annihilation after that because of our circumstances. We don't play that often, and I'd much rather have to just consult a book to say, and a collection of notes to say this is what we've done so far, this is where we're at in the adventure, than have to go back through loads of notes, try and figure out what my thought process was for that specific scenario, and continue on from half remembered ideas I had for encounters and things like that. So guided adventures certainly have their place, and they're a great resource for going back to the specifics D&D. Each of the books that comes with the campaign in it has an appendix of magical items, which is usually unique to that campaign. Which are usually unique to that campaign. They're not in the Dungeon Master's Guide, for example. And some of the monsters they have in the appendices are also unique to that campaign or that setting. So they're great resources for that. And also you can just, a lot of the time you can read through them and think, oh yeah, I like that dungeon, or I like kind of this quest chain. And you can just live them as is or reskin them to fit them into your campaign. There are certainly locations and dungeons I like from Tomb of Annihilation that I'm thinking of taking for my campaign and altering them slightly to fit, but they'll still be essentially the thing from the book. So they're great as is, and they're great inspiration, even if it does require a little bit of prep to tailor them to your specific needs. So the next one, as you can see, is the sandbox campaign. Sandbox campaigns aren't really there aren't many specific books describing them, I guess is the best way to phrase it. By their very nature, because they are open-ended and it's entirely player-driven, it's difficult to prepare for, and indeed it is fairly difficult to run, just because most player groups will kind of, if you don't do it well, they'll pick up on the lack of direction and they'll start floundering about where to go and what to do next. A sandbox campaign, for those of you who don't know, I would be remiss without explaining, is, in my understanding, a campaign where you create the world and kind of seed it with opportunities, but it's up to the players to pick which opportunities to go after. So it kind of, while you can do overarching storylines and like character development, it's difficult to get those things kind of often or to a deep level. The quintessential kind of sandbox mode, to me at least, is the West Marches style of game, where it's driven by a large player pool, arranging their own adventuring parties, and investigating kind of clues, leads, story hooks provided by a pool of DMs to allow for flexible uh, game time. So it's not the same players on the same evening every week. You play with like 3 different groups a month, for example, and you might not have the same DM every time. And that's it's great when it works. It is a lot of fun when it works. Um, and that's kind of the sandbox style campaign. And a lot of the time, if you want to run a sandbox campaign, your best bet is just to get a setting book or to just read the setting chapters of books, because they usually have, well, they'll have a lot of information on the world, um, and certainly some of them have plot hooks associated with each area, with kind of suggested experience levels. So kind of like lower level adventurers, mid tier adventurers, high level adventurers. Um, but obviously, you can alter anything to suit your own purposes or the enjoyment of your party. But as I say, sandbox campaigns totally doable, but they are, in my experience, certainly fairly difficult to pull off consistently well over a long, uh, consistent campaign. And it is worth pointing out that a lot of D&D games fizzle out around level 15 out of 20, certainly from everything I've read. Um, but if that's the natural endpoint for a story, so be it. And certainly with sandbox, a lot of the time, it's probably seems fairly easy to kind of end the game, so to speak, with resolution. But again, I haven't played a long-term sandbox campaign, so I can't give you an authoritative opinion. It's just what it seems like to me. And then there's the living campaign, which is what I primarily do, which is just a mix of the two, really. Uh, this is a with PC engagement. Um, this is how I like running games because it keeps your players focused, um, and it takes from both of them in several ways. Uh, Lower levels certainly, especially with the group I'm playing with, because they were all new to the game, they didn't know each other as people, let alone play characters. I started with some guided stuff. Uh, the basic hook was that they're salaried members of the city secret police, and they were just given missions to go on, and they enjoyed that. But as a hook, as a concept, it's kind of, certainly in Dungeons and Dragons, where player advancement happens relatively frequently, at some point you kind of start wondering why someone's bossing around these incredibly powerful individuals. So I'd already worked out kind of roughly when this guided approach would tail off, so to speak, and they'd reach the more traditional kind of adventurers for hire, or in this case, they're still working for the city, but they're paid on a contract basis rather than a monthly salary, so they pick their own jobs, so to speak. And the players, I put that to the players in game, in character, and they agreed that they chose that approach rather than remaining on the monthly salary. And then in terms of sandbox, having a small scale sandbox helps a lot. Like as I've said before, that it's all based in the same city. So like with anything based in one area, you're going to run into like recurring characters, and I just made those characters quest hook providers, essentially allowing the players to pick up on which hooks they wanted to investigate. And it's worked quite well so far. The players themselves have told me that they'd like to explore more out of the city, and that's fine. I expected they would. They've just been, and partially it's my fault as well, but they've just been investigating the hooks that are in the city. And then when they've picked up on, and you don't have to do this for every plot hook, but some plot hooks can be more guided than others in that there is this kind of discrete narrative throughout the hook, and if they break away from it at any point, they could change the ending for good or ill. I just realised I misspelled engagement. And then the PC engagement side of things, just really pick up on what the players are enjoying. A good example of, and for going into examples and stuff, the getting the right balance of sandbox guided and the mix of the two is incredibly important. And the way I usually handle it is I don't plan out storylines for each level. I plan out story beats that I can insert into the level as appropriate. Or plan is the wrong word, but I create, because I don't often write them down. I mean, that's the purpose of these prep sessions, really, to solidify ideas. But I create story beats that I can insert into any, feasibly, any time in that level, and allow the players to dictate how they get to them. And that's because while it is a role-playing game, and I'm the one behind the scenes with all the characters and all the stories and stuff, I fall heavily into the collaborative GM side of things, where I see my position as a facilitator to tell this cool story with my players and to help them make the story cooler, as opposed to the competitive GM, where I'm moving against them behind the scenes with NPCs and kind of stopping my goals becomes their goal. And I don't, while that is fine and that works for some people, it doesn't work for me. I very much prefer the PCs having their own goals. In the case of the party sorcerer, he wants to start an adventuring company. In the case of the party monk, he wants to get atonement for something he never actually did. As examples, and so the players have their goals, whether they be such grand things as that, or Party Warlock's case, he just wanted some armor, and I deprived him of that accidentally, just through the way things worked out. So I support them in pursuing their own goals, and the kind of the quote unquote storyline of the game progresses in the background where they don't encounter it. But if they're ever in a position to encounter it, obviously they'll learn more about the story as it is at that moment in time and which way to get, how to kind of how to decide how they react to that story beat. But my focus is very much on facilitating their stories and allowing their stories, desires, and actions to drive the game and the overall story. Um, which is why I don't have this hugely intricate villainous plot. Um, and if any of my players are listening, they're going to learn some spoilers. But the plot essentially is uh, the city has offered refuge to an incredibly powerful archfey whose brother wants to kill her. That's the plot. The plot is him trying to tear open a rift into the prime material plane from the Feywild to kill his sister. And of course, he's going to do that in multiple ways. The players recently encountered a coup taking over the city, and that was instigated by him. But I want, at the end of the campaign, I want it to have felt like they've chosen to be where they are and not I've forced them into this position by having this story hammer beating them over the head constantly. Because as a player, I love the feeling that I've had input into the campaign and that I've helped drive the story forward in a meaningful direction and uh, helped with character development of other characters, or I've had especially meaningful character development moments myself. So I try to present opportunities for that as a GM instead of just telling them to go here and do this. But the story beats I create are pretty flexible, so they, as I say, can be inserted anywhere into that level storyline. So, for example, this level storyline is get out of the Shadowfell. They know how to do it. I gave them several choices about how to do it. They chose one of them. That's fine. They are free to change their mind at any point, and the story will progress however whichever direction they take it in. Uh, and really, the only story beats I have are big showdown with Undead Warlock, and that's going to happen wherever they choose for it, quote unquote, choose for it to happen. Whether that's at the walls of the fort as kind of this last-ditch attempt to kill the Knights Arcana, or, as is more likely, the players are going to track down the lair of this undead warlock and kill them there. I say it's more likely because at my table last week, one of my players kind of offhandedly said, "Oh, if we do this brazier thing, they might send us on more covert missions." And so players obviously want to do something like that. I'm not going to be the one to deprive them of that experience. I think it'll be cool to have a dungeon crawl. We haven't really had many. I don't think we've had any big dungeon crawls. And then I'll give them a choice of kind of how they get to the dungeon, and then their choice of that will affect the actual dungeon. So, like listening to this ramble, I can understand if it seems a lot of work to play this way, I guess is the right word. And to some extent, it is and it isn't really. I'm I take every opportunity I can to improvise. Uh, a lot of the time, I just improvise monologues to myself at home. I work at home, so I can do that, and I work alone, so there's no kind of danger of embarrassment. Uh, so a lot of it is just comfort improvising things, and some of that does come from knowing the rules well. Uh, when I don't know a system as well, I think it definitely shows, but my players have never really complained when I've done something outside of 5th edition, so or something I don't know as well as I know several rule sets. So improvisation and knowing the rules help a lot. Reading around the subject, so having this kind of trove of potential traps or uh, atmospheric markers, so to speak, or environmental storytelling clues that you can see throughout scenes um, that are suitably vague, so they can be interpreted in any number of ways. And if you have an idea of several ways they could be interpreted and the players pick up on one, boom, like that's how it was intended all along. They don't need to know any better, so to speak. You're not trying to hoodwink them. You're not trying to trick them. At the end of the day, certainly my GMing style, as I say, it's collaborative. We're all there for fun. And as I've said a few times previously, just and it goes hand in hand with the improv stuff. Don't don't be afraid to change things on the fly. Nothing is set in stone until it's in the game. Which is why I create these deliberately vague story beats. Yes, some of my previous levels have had multiple story beats, but they've all been ambiguous as to where they could be located, apart from like level ending story beats or big moments, which are usually level ending story beats because of experience reasons, which I'll get onto shortly. Um, I keep them vague. I keep them fluid. If one doesn't come up, one doesn't come up. Then none of them are integral to the storyline. Um, and when they are integral, there are ways and means of bringing them about anyway. And I'm not saying just kind of drag the players around with a plot hook, but any, to my mind, any suitably important plot thread or info dump or anything like that, you should have it written. You should be able to communicate it in a form that is essentially sourceless, so that you can deliver it through any um, method at your disposal, or as actually happened to me in this campaign, don't feel like because you've planned exposition to happen at some point that it has to happen then. If the opportunity occurs for it to happen earlier, go for it, do it. It makes the payoff further away, but for some players that will make the payoff better. For an example, so the party monk, uh, the thing that he did, which he's no, the thing which he didn't do, which he's atoning for, is related to the destruction of a village in which he was possessed by a shadow demon. And by possessed, I mean it didn't take his body over and destroy the village. The village happened during the fight, which weakened it, driving it to flee into his body. And he didn't realize the demon was in him. Um, sure, I seeded clues that the other PCs did see, but they didn't tell him. Um, like there was a moment where the monk was confronted with uh, this world's this homebrew setting's god of light and healing, and the player character saw these two shadowy wings come from his back, and every opportunity I had to describe the scars on the monk's chest, I said they were claw marks, or it looked like something had tried to scratch its way in. And I never expected the player to actually figure out that their character was possessed. Certainly not this early in the campaign. I had clues that I could insert throughout the campaign. And again, just, oh, 1 second. Okay, sorry about that. One of my players rang me. Also happens to be my fiance, so can't really ignore the call. And I was expecting it at some point anyway. Where was I? Clues, story beats, yes. I'd seeded. I had clues I could seed throughout the campaign about this possession, but which I thought would be a cool kind of gradually developing storyline. The player went to a church and then started saying the exact right things that led to an exorcism, essentially. Like, the character didn't know they were possessed, and they'd never expressed any suspicion that they were possessed. But I think it was they said they felt they had this kind of weight on them, and one thing led to another. This is all happening so long ago, I can't remember exactly what was said. But the priestess they were talking to decided to offer this exorcism, and it was intended from their point of view to just be a kind of, and when I say exorcism, I don't mean kind of tie them down to a bed, chant over them kind of thing. It was intended to be a spiritual exercise. Let's get rid of that. Kind of just going through the motions of this ritual too, which usually in world would bring peace. It was the whole ritual is designed to engulf the recipient in the healing light of the chorus. This three is one deity, but it is an exorcism, and I thought, what the hell? Why not do it now? So at level 4, the players have an exorcism performed. Well, one of the players have an exorcism performed on their character. And it proved a cool boss fight. It was the first one I used any 3D papercraft terrain with. Previously, it's just been flat 2D maps. Players seemed to enjoy it, and it was a really cool story beat. Would it have been cooler with a better payoff if this suspicion had been building for longer? At this point, we're I think a year and a half into the game, and we're in at level 5. So if we'd had like the extra 10 levels or so that I was anticipating, would the payoff have been better? Probably. We'll never know, but it was a cool boss fight. It was incredible roleplay experience for the entire party as they came to terms with what had happened. And on the tail end of that, I made the party an eventual boss fight with the party easier because the warlock had a staff, which essentially meant that there was a jewel set into the staff, which had they encountered this noble they've been hunting since the start of the game, with this gem in place, the warlock would have been charmed by him for the entire encounter, because of the presence of this gem. And that gem got broken by the priestess, who took one look at it and went, "Oh no, that's bad," and destroyed it. Chaos Bolt is an incredible spell, and also provided a huge exposition dump, which I typed up afterwards and put up on the Trello board that we use as a campaign journal and map thing, so my players can reference it, and so I don't forget what I said. And both of those things, well, the exposition was great because the players could learn more about the world, and again, that was stuff that was supposed to happen 10 levels down the line or so, but I don't care. Players enjoyed the exposition. It gave them something to look for. And as I say, the breaking of the gem made the whole situation later down the line far easier for the party, not being deprived of one of their spellcasters. So that's just kind of practical example of knowing when to realize that nothing's set in stone and when to move story beats around to suit the story the players are telling. Because I didn't feel that I'd be doing that character's story justice if nothing happened at that moment, and then somewhere down the line they had to do essentially the same thing and had a payoff. Then it didn't feel right to me. So I, as I say, there's usually kind of 1 or 2 story beats per level for the overarching storyline, or for the storyline they're currently pursuing, I should say. But then I have a few story beats for each character that I seed throughout the game, because to my mind, the game should be, as I've said, driven by the characters, and that's not going to happen without their stories being present in the main narrative. Hence, why the Knight Captain is one of the adventurers that rescued the sorcerer. Um, Another member of that adventuring party is a halfling that taught the warlock magic. The one of the quote unquote kind of secondary antagonists. Well, it's not quote unquote. They are one of the secondary antagonists. They're tied in with the monk's monastery and with the forest that he grew up in. And then the fighter's storyline is tied up with one of the other secondary antagonists, who is also one of the warlock's primary antagonists. So I tried to get this web of interweaving storylines, and it seems coincidental and contrived, I guess, from an outside point of view. But if you think of the timescale that we're experiencing this game on, we only play for about 2 hours every Monday, and because I do this predominantly hands-off, non-guided approach to storytelling, it takes a long time to do anything, and that's fine. The players they love the role play aspect, as I think most players do, and they're happy to take the time getting from level to level. And I do ask them and seek constant feedback about, uh, are we progressing swiftly enough for you? And so far I've had no negative feedback about the speed that the story is progressing at. And again, I think that's because it's the player's choices driving progression and not mine. Going back to the shopping thing, essentially my players have had 4 weeks of in-game downtime before their boss gets back with an item that will make things easier for them, because they have no dedicated healer and a lot of glass cannons. In fact, they're all glass cannons apart from the warlock. Not the warlock, the fighter. So their boss is coming back with, and if you like this magic item, cool. It's essentially it's an item that you have to attune to, and it has 9 charges, and you can expend, you can cast cleric spells that you would be able to cast were you a single class cleric through this item. So at the cost of 1 charge per spell level, you can't cast cantrips with it. Or I might have worded it that a cantrip is still 1 charge. I can't remember. But essentially, it's the idea that because they have no real source of healing beyond what healing potions they can find. This was intended to help with that when the cleric left because the player had to leave. So they had these 4 weeks of downtime where the boss, because of the distances involved, and you can't teleport with this item because it screws up the magic, and rather than casting a cleric spell, a wild magic effect happens the first time that you try to cast a cleric spell after you've teleported with it. So they went shopping, and we spent, I think, 4 weeks doing a day a session, as in 1 in-game day per session, as the party split up into 4. Well, the characters just split up into 4 separate things each session, essentially. And that was fine, and I worried about progression kind of feeling like it stagnated. But they said it was okay. And I brought them back together for some story beats, which hopefully, well, they'll serve as foreshadowing if they pick up on it, obviously. If not, then they still had fun, they told me afterwards. But things like that are great for well, exorcisms, character development, and character story beats rather than like main narrative story beats. And having these story beats rather than set arcs works really well with narrative milestone experience. For those of you unaware, D&D and other games have a few different ways of awarding experience for character advancement purposes. I think the default one is combat orientated, with monsters having a set experience value that is awarded when you beat that monster, and then you get rewards for role playing and for other non-combat stuff. But it's primarily based around kind of goal-orientated rewards. That works for some people. That's fine. It's a lot of maths if you're not taking pre-gen encounters. And to be honest, it's not for me. I like having a sense of progression in my advancement. A sense of achievement in my advancement rather than just beating X number of monsters. So I go with narrative milestones where after a significant story beat, the players level up essentially, which is why I work in story beats rather than storylines, because yeah, you can do it. You can do this with storylines. They can do the whole storyline for that level, and this is in fact how I started the game. And then they get to the end of that storyline, level up, and then on to the next one, or at a point appropriate in that storyline, they level up, and then the storyline continues. But I felt that was too limiting in a way. It wasn't flexible enough for the game I wanted to run. And I guess one of the unstated purposes of this entire streaming thing is to help you find the game that you want to run or the style that you prefer. And I know people who prefer this kind of more guided experience, and certainly the like, as a player, the game I play in feels, and I'm not saying it is, I'm just saying it feels more guided in that we are going from point A to B to Z and so on and so forth. Yes, we make choices along the way, and there are character development moments, and my DM's great and lets us kind of retire characters to do their own side things while the plot's somewhere else, and that's fine. That works really well. It's still an incredibly fun game. It's just not the game I habitually run, I guess. It's not the game that I've internalized how to run, I guess is a better way of putting it. But as I say, if that works for you, more power to you. That works for you. There's no wrong way as long as everyone's having fun to run a role-playing game at the tabletop or over the internet, as the case may be. I just hope that this 55-minute ramble at this point has had some useful information in it for you, and that the other videos, which if you've missed them, I think they're still up on the Twitch archive, but I also upload them to YouTube. The YouTube channel is Comrade Bubbles. I hope they've got some useful information. I try to keep them about an hour long. Don't feel like you have to listen to the whole ramble. Stop whenever you want to. Dear God, I couldn't listen to myself for an hour. But yeah, as I said, the whole point is to, I guess, to help you find a game style that you're comfortable with running. These are my approaches to story design, and they're what the living game works for me. Never really explained living. It's a living world. The world lives on around the player characters. They're not the focus of the attention. Um, and if you ever have questions, like Twitch chat, obviously YouTube comments, I'll probably read them depending on how I'm feeling at the time. Uh, that's not a comment on lack of desire for feedback and interaction. I have mental health problems, and sometimes YouTube comments really upset me on other channels. So it might be a case of I'm a bit hesitant about reading those on my channel. Um, and a lot of the stuff that I talk about on these videos can be found in sort of a different format at that's how we roll dice.wordpress.com, a tabletop blog that I run, um, which has a series of kind of intro to role playing articles as well as just all purpose gaming aids. I think that's everything I wanted to talk about. So, kind of in summary, so really, if you do want to listen to my thoughts on any of these subjects, more power to you for wanting that. Generally skip to about the 55-minute mark where I try and sum everything up. So main approaches to story design I found guided storylines, pre-written, which are primarily pre-written campaigns and adventures, but they serve as good inspiration if you don't want to run that kind of game. But why would you pass up all that ready prepared material? Like it's incredible having that resource. It takes a lot of stress off of you as the designer of the story and of the game, of your own particular game, I should say. Um, but their main drawback is they're not flexible, they're not open-ended. You have to be really comfortable with the setting if you want to make them flexible and open-ended because you have to improvise stuff. And sandbox gameplay, great for West March style games, difficult to do well consistently outside of that setting. It's very easy to pick up on a lack of direction from either the players or the GM. But a lot of setting books are a great resource for this and provide quest hooks, which you can obviously take and alter for your own games. And then there's the living game, which is what I prefer, where it's a mix of guided scenarios or just open-ended plot hooks for players to investigate, and a lot of player-driven story, where the storyline's planned out in discrete story beats, which can be plugged in wherever it feels right for them to be plugged in. And it does require a certain understanding of, I guess it sounds pretentious to say it, but a certain understanding of narrative, or more accurately, I guess, of the narrative your players are enjoying, but still one that you want to tell. And I think really that's it. I've made it an hour without once mentioning the term railroad, and that was a conscious decision on my part. I hate the term so much. It has so many negative connotations, but if you can't tell, that's what guided is. Railroading, if done well, can be very useful. It can provide direction. It can provide but it provides an obvious storyline for the players to follow if they're struggling, or as I said 20 odd minutes ago, I think at this point, if your players don't know each other as people, or their characters don't know each other, having a guided experience, or if you prefer, a railroad, where they have to stick to the tracks, they can't divert from them, hence the connotations. Having that experience helps so much because it gives these disparate groups, these people who don't know each other, or who might not necessarily know the game even, direction and something obvious to do, rather than saying your characters all meet in X location, here is the world, here are some plot hooks, do what you want. That might work for some people. It probably won't work for a lot of people. I know that my players don't like having too many choices, and I certainly sometimes get analysis paralysis, as where I've just got too many choices to make. So it does have its place. When it's done poorly, it ruins the game because there's no player agency. So if you do prefer guided experiences, and that's the game you prefer running, practice a lot, and I'd say also talk to your players a lot about what they like and don't like about how you're doing things, because it's very easy to get it right, but it's also very easy to get it wrong. I think that's really it. Like I said, if there are any questions, there's Twitch chat, YouTube comments, comradebubbles@gmail.com also works. I check that irregularly, but I do check it. I hope that this has at least been useful, or inspiring is kind of the wrong word, I guess, but I know I ramble, but I hope that the rambling does provide some kind of practical examples of the theory I'm trying to explain. And if you think my theory is confusing, please by all means let me know. As I said last time, I'm going to run out of stuff to talk about anyway, because once I've covered these broad categories of story design, encounter design, NPCs, what have you, these streams are going to be shorter because they're just going to be a recap and then kind of what I want to tap, what I think might happen in the next session, and any encounter design prep I need to do. So yeah, if I get questions asking me to clarify stuff, I will 100% try to clarify it in a future stream. I've been thinking about things like when I'm doing dungeon prep, I might stream that. I might not, because a lot of it will just be me drawing dungeons in probably GIMP, free alternative to Photoshop, and I don't know if I can talk to myself for that long without people kind of prompting me with questions or comments, giving me ideas, kind of thing. It's something I might experiment with, and if I do, I will 100% put the finished dungeon up somewhere for download purposes, probably on my website, the link of which is always in the YouTube description. But I think that's everything that I wanted to cover today. It has been about an hour again, minus the phone call in the middle of it. So if you do have anything you want to say, please say it now. I will probably be silent for a few minutes, just that the delay catch up, but I'll leave the stream going. I'll stop the recording for the YouTube, but I'll leave the stream going while I do a few things. And if you want to post in the chat, by all means post in the chat. If not, no worries. I'll probably do another stream next Monday around lunchtime for me. So 12:30ish GMT +1, because I think that's what we're in at the moment in England. And if not, hope you have a good week.